Boardroom Bound, Episode 36, Why You Want to Be a Trustee, with Jim Rullo.
When I retired, I think they suggest that you sit back for 6 months and not really get involved and look at what you want to do.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. And a quick special announcement for those of you who've been listening to past episodes. If you remember back in number 24, we had Peter Gleason on the show, and he is the CEO of the National Association of Corporate Directors. And their annual event is called The Summit. It's in Washington, D.C., September 21 to 24, and the Boardroom Bound podcast is part of it. I will be one of the speakers at the event. We are leading a Monday morning session. We're actually recording a live episode of this podcast. So you, dear listener, will have a chance to sit in the audience, to participate in it, to be part of the Q&A, to really engage in this podcast in a different format. Very excited to be meeting so many of you in person at the event. And in today's show, we'll be speaking with Jim Rullo. He retired in 2014 as a senior vice president and partner from Wellington Management Company. He is a member of the Board of Trustees at Babson College and chairs the investment committee at the Boys and Girls Club of Lawrence. Previously served as a board of advisors for the Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Boston. And in today's show, we're going to be exploring a number of fascinating topics with Jim. He's going to be a great case study of someone who is very successful in his career, one that I resonate with. He was in the Wall Street finance space, and then how, as that, what he calls his first act, his primary business role finished, and he started his second act, what some people would call retirement, he transitioned into multiple board opportunities. He has 2 roles where he has a fiduciary responsibility, several others where he's an advisor and not yet in a fiduciary responsibility. That'll probably come later. And how does he manage choosing between the opportunities, finding the right intersection between his skill set and his interest, organizations that he's passionate about, and what he recommends for other people that are also taking that forward and thinking, how do I find the right fit for me? So we've got some honest comments from Jim about how that works. Let's jump into the show. Jim Rullo, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to have you in studio. That's a treat for me as well. Most of our people are dialed in via phone, and we had a good time catching up beforehand, a lot of similarities in our background, and maybe you can give a little bit of an overview for people. We're going to talk about your board career today, but what you did beforehand influences a lot of what you do and how you do it today. So maybe you can give us a background scene.
Sure. I guess from 30,000 feet, I spent about 30 years in the investment business, mostly centered here in the area in Boston, working for Boston company Panagora and Wellington Management Company. I spent most of my career in the quantitative investment framework, and we managed quite a bit of assets, around max around $30 billion in assets. We had clients all over the world.
Those sound like big numbers to people who aren't in finance, but those are normal numbers in finance.
I think that's a big number for a small division in a big company.
True.
But yes, you're right. If you talk about the size of the Vanguard Index 500 mutual fund, it's nothing compared to that. Yeah. So yeah. So you're right. What I did in my career had a lot to do with what I do now on boards, and really, I started my board work mostly as a small-time volunteer and just writing checks because that's the only time I had. And when I retired, or as we call it, Wellington withdrew from the partnership, I had a lot more time, and I wanted to go beyond writing checks and actually become involved.
And so it was at that moment when you left full-time employment, you were thinking, now I've got the bandwidth. It wasn't before. How did you make that mental switch? Because some people are wrestling with, should I do that now when I have this opportunity in a high-profile role, and how do I fit it in? What was your thought process?
Well, I guess a lot of people join boards for all different reasons. Sometimes people join boards for professional reasons, for connections, to meet people, because coworkers invite them on boards. I found while I was working, it was truly a full-time job. It was trading in global equity markets. They're open 5 days a week, which is really 6 days a week because it's 24 hours a day times 7. And I was traveling a lot. I had 3 young sons at that time, coaching them and playing with them. So I really didn't have time to commit to as a board seat and go beyond that sort of small commitment that I was doing on an advisory role.
Well, I actually think that's a wise choice that you were consciously going through. Where do I spend my time and how do I value it? And that's important because a board role is a significant commitment and it can vary a lot by an organization, especially nonprofit, but knowing what you're getting into and being able to do it well. So clearly you were saying someday, but not today.
Someday, not today. And once I got into the boards, so I'm a trustee in a couple of boards now, and I'm still involved with a few other boards. It truly is a big time commitment. And for those people who are more involved, to say as chair, it's actually a full-time job. But I'm involved in committees on the boards, investment committees and finance committees. And that's really where the work is done on boards, is at the committee level. And so if you're going to be involved with the board, I would suggest that you try to find how you can contribute the most. And for me, that's I ended up being in the finance committee and the investment committee for that specific reason. That's where what limited skills I had intersected with the needs for the board.
I would call it specialist expertise that you bring that they desperately need. And so there's so much we can unpack here. Let's start with that. So how does someone, and you're a great example, how does someone say, let me figure out exactly what I've done really well and then how I take that forward? Did you approach it as, I will go find the organizations maybe I'm passionate about and the ones that need this skill set? Did they come and seek you out because they knew of your reputation? How did it actually start? What was your first board role and how did it go?
So when I retired, I think they suggest that you sit back for 6 months and not really get involved and look at what you want to do. I remember going to take a management training program, and there was a little bit in the management training program while I was at Wellington. They talked about your next act, and you had to prepare for your next act. Well, I didn't heed that advice, and I didn't really spend any time preparing for my next act because I was too busy with my
current act.
Okay. And so I was on the advisory board at the graduate school at Babson College, and that basically I moved into a trustee position there. And at roughly at the same time, a very good friend of mine and a gentleman who I respect tremendously asked me if I would be interested in working with Essex County Community Foundation. And it was an opportunity to work with him again. I didn't know anything about the organization. And so I signed on, more so because I'm a big fan of John, and I realized that it was going to be a lot of fun working there.
Okay.
And he's really done a fabulous job with the organization. Yeah.
And so that's a great example of, let's call that in the networking example. So you have a reputation, a skill set, and expertise. People are coming to you and saying, I think we could use you here. And from what I hear you saying, and when we've talked about this the other direction of when someone is being recruited for a board role, John, just like you talked about, is saying, I know someone that I can vouch and I can bring in. And that's so important to a board to have that, right? You were on the flip side of that. You're the one being recruited. Was your initial reaction of, great, this is exactly what I needed, that's why it landed with me, or let me think about this and get back to you? How did that actually happen?
So I attended a few meetings, and there was a need on the investment committee. So I think I was involved with the investment committee before I became a trustee. And then I saw that there were a lot of areas that were interesting to me, and I thought I could contribute. So it wasn't an organization that I went searching for. It was an organization that found me, and I'm glad they did.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I know we were talking about this beforehand, that's not the limit of what you've done, right? You've also been involved with the Boys and Girls Club of Lawrence, running their investment committee.
And I'm an alum.
Okay. All right.
It was a boys' club when I was there.
So it did good, right? So it grew and developed into an organization you're able to contribute back to. That must feel great.
It's fun. That's a great group. They do fabulous work there.
And you told me you were born in Lawrence as well, so you clearly a tie to that community.
Yeah, Lawrence. But I was raised in North Andover. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then also the Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese of Boston involved there, another big opportunity.
Well, that's when I was in Boston, and a friend of mine was on the advisory board, and it's basically a fundraising role, and asked me if I wanted to join it, so I went ahead and did that, and that was a lot of fun. Our biggest job was basically running their annual fundraising ball.
Okay.
And their fundraising ball, as well as their summer events as well.
And for all of these different opportunities you've had now, and I'd love, we'll pick ECF as an example and do a deep dive into it. So we've talked about ECCF on this show before. Episode 7, Beth Francis was on, who runs the organization. We'll talk about in a few minutes again what she was specifically sharing that opportunity there. But as you think about, so you are now a member of the inside club of an organization. You're on the board. You will be thinking about recruiting other board members. So in a sense, when they brought Jim on, you're now going to bring the next Jim on at some point. Give us a sense of what it's like inside the room as you're picking out people, trying to figure out who's the right fit, how you go about that. I think your audience would be helpful to hear, how should I be positioning myself?
So I guess that starts mostly with internal conversations, and it's all funneled through the governance committee. So all the work, the important work on boards, and my guess is this is true for corporate boards. I'm not on a corporate board, but my guess is it's the same. The important work is done at the committee level.
Right.
So on the investment committee, for example, we manage the endowment, the foundation, at the discretion of the entire board of trustees. The finance committee is responsible for effectively the P&L statement, the balance sheet of the organization. And the governance committee is responsible for the governance of the organization, the line of succession for the CEO, the vice appointing the chair, and finding new committees, committee members as well, trustee members. And so if I had a name of someone that I thought would be interested, I would go to the chair of the governance committee and mention that person, and they would start the investigation.
So that comes back to the networking we were talking about before. So something we've described on the show is, my philosophy is it doesn't matter who you know. What matters is who you know and what they know about you. So, for example, if I were determined that I wanted to be on an investment committee member for a local nonprofit, if that's just in my head, it's much less likely that Jim Rullo is going to know about that and recommend me.
Right.
So give an example of, perhaps from your philosophy or your recommendation, of someone who's in that position and thinking, okay, they should approach me, they know me, I'm on a board, that would be helpful. How do you think about it?
So I'll give you a perfect example. I won't use any names. Gentleman I had worked with, good grief, 25, 30 years ago, and we were friendly, but we sort of moved off in different sides of the career, and it was 2 firms ago, so I hadn't spoken with him for a while, and I ran into him actually at the Institute for Trustees that we run at Essex County Community Foundation, and he is a very involved, very civic-oriented person, and we were just chatting, and then he sent me an email saying if I had an opening, he would love to join the investment committee. He's not a trustee of the board, but he's a trustee of some other organizations here in the Essex County. And I thought that was fabulous. I knew his background and brought him right along. And he contributed from day one.
Which is what you want, right?
Which is what you want.
And it's a known quantity, which is very different than some person you've never heard of before expressing interest, which is also a good thing, but then you have to vet them in a different way.
Right, but if this person came up to me at the Institute for Trustees and said, Jim, I hear you're running the investment committee, I have a great candidate other than myself, I'd certainly listen to it based on his recommendation. So yeah.
And let's get a little bit more deep dive into the organization opportunity you're talking about, because ECCF, we heard about this on episode 7 from Beth Francis, but my outsider's perspective on it, this is an amazing opportunity for people in this area of, let's call it the North Boston area, who are looking to be engaged with a local nonprofit, who bring a certain skill set. It's almost like a matching exercise and a training exercise for the days, which from a nonprofit perspective is fabulous, right? They all need good board members. Can you give us your perspective on that training and how it goes about, and why something like that could be valuable for someone who's thinking, how do I get involved in a nonprofit?
The training for the board members? We first, becoming a board member, first, our collection of board members is really a very powerful group. I'd like to think it's one of the most active, participative boards in the local area. And the way we find board members obviously varies, but a lot of it comes from word of mouth. Mm-hmm. And the way we bring them on board is we sign them. Well, the governance committee takes most of this responsibility, but they assign mentors. Mm-hmm. They have a training session, which they invite other existing board members to. And because one of the things that you'll realize when you join an organization, there's a lot more behind it. And they do a lot more than what meets the eye. And then, of course, you have to understand the dictionary of acronyms. Right. So, the first thing I do when I join any organization is I literally ask for a dictionary of acronyms, or else I get lost.
I remember when I joined J.P. Morgan, they didn't have one. I started building my own. I think I stopped at about page 6.
Right.
It's just too much to take in.
Right. And for those of us who are in the investment business, an acronym is another word for a ticker. Right. And we live and die by trading tickers or symbols. And but when you get here, all those acronyms mean something else. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Everybody loves the TLAs, the 3-letter acronyms. And so I think what you're talking about is a great best practice, but doesn't exist at all organizations, especially nonprofits maybe that are newer or smaller. And it's a privilege and a benefit, obviously, if you can have an onboarding experience, but not everybody does it really well. And I think if you're joining one and they don't have one, you probably need to advocate for yourself and at least get time with some of the leaders and some of the other board members, because you want to add value right away. That's why you joined. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. And again, I'll go back to the committee level, and that you can really immerse yourself in a very narrow part of the organization through a committee. Mm-hmm. And within that committee, then you'll learn yourself. Well, particularly, so at Babson College, I'm on the audit committee. And when I first got to Babson, the chair of the board asked me what committees I'd like to join, and I said anything but the audit committee.
Yeah, right.
And quite frankly, the audit committee's been a blast, a lot of fun.
You don't hear that very often about an audit committee.
Well, it is. And one of the reasons is you see the entire organization. You touch the finance committee, you touch the investment committee, you touch the governance committee. So that would be one of my first suggestions is if you're a new board member, join the audit committee. But anyways, get involved at a micro level within the board through a committee. And then I think you can start to learn it from the inside out.
It's interesting you say that. So when I joined the North Shore YMCA here, which is one of the 30 biggest in the country, we started having conversations saying, where should I start on which committee? Because you only want to start on one, right? You want to dip your toes and figure out the acronyms in the organization. And we're choosing between strategy from my background. Should I be on the finance committee, the audit committee, whatever it might be, governance? And from my perspective, I like the strategy level where I'm starting, because I feel like it gives me a chance to wrap my head around the 30,000-foot view of the organization, and then we can do a deep dive. At some point, my background would fit being on the finance committee, which I feel like then you get a deeper dive build up from the bottom of how that organization grows and develops. But I think this is an important point for our audience of not only where do you fit, but it's also potentially for some people a stretch opportunity. Try a new committee, but you'd learn the organization in a different way. So if you've been with an organization for a long time, there are lots of different ways to be involved. And let's say you're a marketing person They might have brought you in specifically for that. But if you want to grow and develop perhaps into, say, the strategy space, getting on the strategy committee is good for the next roles as well. Can you talk about how maybe ECCF, as a good organization example, thinks about how much people move around between committees? If someone joins the invest committee, are they there for life? Do they have a chance to move and grow into other things?
Sure. I'm not exactly sure of the bylaws, and I'm more familiar with the way the bylaws are written in some other organizations, but most bylaws state that X percent or X number of committee members should be trustees.
Right.
And because of that, and ECCF is a relatively small board. We're somewhere around 16 to 20 names, people right now. And we have 5 or so committees. All of us are probably on more than one committee.
Right.
And I think it would be nice to rotate among committees. It's particularly important so that when my term as chair of the investment committee is up, that there will be a trustee that was on the committee along with me that has that sort of historical perspective.
Right. That succession planning is so important to go seamlessly from strength to strength.
Right. And honestly, one of the things I think for such a small foundations, for such a small organization, we have all those guidelines. We have succession planning for our CEO, succession planning for our board chair, good set of guidelines and bylaws. So it's incredibly professionally run for a small organization, and I think that's a testament to the leadership.
And we talk about those things as if they should just be normal and average. And to some extent they should be, but not every organization's there and can do it well. But those are so important in terms of best practices.
It is. So I can tell you that through some personal work, I'm involved with another charitable organization, and very concerned because I wanted to make an investment with this organization. And I asked in my first meeting with the organization, what is the succession plan for you? Because I wanted to make sure my investment in this organization was sound. And they didn't have one. So I asked them to create one.
It's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And we've seen recently, so nearby us, Endicott College, one of our schools that's local to us, their longstanding president, Dr. Wiley, passed away, and it was a surprise to most people. And you do not see that very often in a college, that a president would pass away while in office. And they've had to scramble because they didn't have a succession plan in place. He was a force, right? He had really brought that organization forward. Just a great example that things happen, and being prepared is essential. That's why risk committees mean so much. And we've seen that in the business world, right? And even, you remember JP Morgan, our risk committee had a problem. The London whale happened.
Right, exactly.
Things happen.
Right. Were you in London then?
I was not.
When the whale was there.
I was not there, but the stories still live on. Jamie Dimon said that was Risk Management 101. We didn't have a risk person on our risk committee.
Right.
And even if JP Morgan could screw that up, it really tells the rest of us that we need to pay attention to it.
Oh, you can. Risk committees belong in every organization. It doesn't matter whether it's the local Boys and Girls Club, the YM. Just think about the opportunity for a catastrophe like that to strike, or some other type of catastrophe. So yes, the risk committee is very important.
So in some ways, we're talking about best practices here. Great ideas that we would love every organization to have. But much like there's a learning curve for an organization to get to this, there's a learning curve for a board member. So we've talked about how you began your board career and you started on a few of these. I imagine there was a learning curve for you, and a big difference between being an executive who's managing and suddenly being a board member. What was that like? What were some of the lessons learned that you went through as you went up that curve?
Well, there's many. And I think that the organizations I've been involved with as a board member get it right by slowly building board members up through the committee level. But in terms of my training, I think it's important for the the chair of the board to have an idea of why he or she is bringing you on board in the first place.
Sure.
And you should probably have that conversation with the chair. Okay, how can I help before I join the board? And what resources will there be for me so that I can help? Because that's really why you're on the board, is to help at the end of the day. So I think you should, as a new board member, investigate these things prior to joining.
And we talked about earlier that you, for some of the organizations before you joined, you had almost previewed what a board meeting was like. You sat in on it. And I have heard from other board people who said, I've tried that as well. There's one person for a paid board role that she had offered, her first one. She was ready to accept, and she said, well, let me just go to one meeting. And a fist fight literally broke out in the meeting. She said, this is not the organization for me.
Right.
I'm sure that didn't happen on your organizations. But talk us through what that is like, that sort of due diligence that you did. Okay, I went to a meeting to assess and make sure it was a right fit for me. What was in your mind? How would you recommend someone else said, I'll sign whatever NDA you need, but I'd like to go sit in a meeting. Give us your perspective on that.
So again, my initial meeting was at the committee level, where I had a certain level of expertise already. So, and everything that was being discussed at that committee level meeting, I was pretty well versed in. So, but I saw the inner workings of the organization, and I saw that they took their role very seriously, and that it was as professional of an environment as the investment meetings I sat in previously as an investment professional.
That's saying a lot. That's impressive.
Well, I also had a lot of, so one of my roles while I was at Wellington would be meeting with, and we managed a lot of county assets, a lot of supranational assets. We managed a lot of union assets. And I was always involved with the investment board and the investment committee as presenting to them, because I would be managing, responsible for some of their assets. So I had seen how these investment committees had worked in the past. And I had seen what worked and what didn't work. And so that helped me as well.
And I wonder if you could also talk to us. So in some ways, we talk a lot in the show about someone getting their first board role, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. Some people position to, I'll call it a portfolio of board opportunities. And now that you're in your second act, as we've talked about, as you figure out what is the right way to spend my time and my talents, where do I invest that? I would say today you have a portfolio of organizations that you're involved with. Is there a different mentality for someone who's saying, I've just got one group I do a deep dive with, spend a lot of time with, versus now I'm going to be involved in different ways with different organizations? How do you think about that?
So first I'm on various committees and on the two boards where I have fiduciary responsibility. And that takes a lot of my time. I am on advisory roles in a couple of other committees and other boards without fiduciary responsibility. And those advisory roles are really sort of the bench for future board seats. And I am not. I know that at this point in time, in terms of my ability to focus on that I'm probably at my personal maximum for fiduciary responsibility. And when I roll off one of the boards that I'm on, I'll probably roll on to another. Or if I roll off some committees, I'll roll on to the other. As well as I'm involved in some other non-board activities, investment groups, personal investment groups, where my family and I are very much actively involved in with young adults with special needs because of I have a son that has a special need. So I need to take that into consideration as well. So
it sounds like your dance card is pretty full, but mostly in really good ways.
It's full. When people ask, so Jim, you're retired now, what do you do? It's like, that's an unfair question.
So you're not playing golf all day every day.
I'm busy. No, I'm not playing golf every day.
Well, it sounds like it's been very fulfilling for you, which is
Right.
exciting. So
Right.
my translation is you were very successful in your business career and you brought that skill set to organizations where you give back to them from that, but also you're excited about them. You're passionate about what they're doing. We've talked about ECCF a lot. I think a wonderful organization. And one of the things Beth Francis talked about before was the annual training where they're matching organizations, people who want to be involved, which just gives people a chance in their second act or maybe still during their first act on the side, ways to help that out. So
Right.
As you think about sort of maybe parting advice for someone who's a new board member, if you were going to wrap it up and say, this is the one most important thing I would recommend as you go down that journey maybe from your own career, what would you say?
So I did mention in passing the Institute for Trustees, and we do various things at Essex County Community Foundation. We manage donor assets, that donor advised funds. We strengthen and support nonprofits, and the primary way we do that is through this Institute for Trustees, or the acronym is IFT.
Right.
And we hold trustee training at that seminar, and it's widely attended, and it's once a year in March. That's honestly, I would suggest that any prospective board member attend that to really understand. One of the things you need to understand is when you move from business to board, that your role is really changing. It's more strategic and less functional, less organizational. In other words, your job is to make sure the organization you're working with has the tools and the people to fulfill their mission. Your job is not necessarily to define that mission.
Right.
Your job is not necessarily to set the budget. Your job is to find the people to lead that organization.
Right. Well, Jim, in terms of the conversation, I imagine there might be some people going, wow, this is great. I've learned so much from this. I wish I could have asked one or two additional questions. If someone wanted to follow up, is there a way that you would recommend they contact?
I think I could be reached through the Essex County Community Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So
I can put that in the show notes as a link.
Yeah.
So that's great.
That's great.
And Jim, we were delighted to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more boardroom bound.
It was a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time and having me.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Jim Rullo. Clearly, his background and experience resonate with mine working in the financial services industry and thinking how someone takes their specific time and talents. And Jim, for his second act after he left and retired, how do you find the right organizations to invest that into? And Jim has multiple nonprofit board roles, several where he's a fiduciary responsibility, several others where he's just an advisory capacity, but where you find the way to give back. And for many people listening to this show, that's exactly what you're mapping out. So I'm sure Jim's is a great case study example. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get links to all of the resources that we talked about today, including the link to the trustee training at Essex County Community Foundation, a great example of how you can find a local nonprofit organization to help prepare you, to train you, and to match you with groups that need your skill set. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, or frankly any episode of the podcast, I'd be really grateful if you would open up in Stitcher or iTunes or Google Play or wherever you're listening to this, and just take 30 seconds to leave a review and a rating. This is the best way that we get out a word about the show. I'd also encourage you to subscribe and stay tuned in because every week we're working hard to bring you top quality content. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.